Hi, welcome back to Making Menches. My name is Alana.
And I'm Jessie.
And we are talking about all things gossip this mini series. Today, we're just focusing on gossip as a cultural tool and all of the cool ways that manifests. And we have a special guest today.
Yeah, can I introduce Abby and then Abby can introduce herself because I feel like Abby will not say all the incredible things. Abby's a scholar, a Jewish educator. She is just really knowledgeable about tons of topics in Jewish education and beyond. And she is a gossip expert. So that's why I'm so excited. She's the one that suggested this series and got the ball rolling on all of it too. So really excited to have Abby. Sorry, now you can
No,
introduce
I
yourself.
feel like that was it. I love gossip. I feel like that's my tagline. I love gossip. I love everything about it.
That's going to be the title of this episode. I love gossip. I love everything about it. Thanks for being here. People might be curious why we're talking about gossip because we are like generally a Jewish education-esque podcast. I think that's probably our brand at this point. And that's because gossip is a huge part of Judaism. And I feel like we see that grounded in the idea of the yenta a lot. And so even though this episode is going to be focused more on gossip in general, I wanted to ground us in the Jewishness of a yenta and just give some background on that. So Abby, Jessie, feel free to interrupt me at any point to add in some yenta tidbits of your own. Basically, yenta is what's considered a Yinglish word, which is a combination of Yiddish and English. So it's not actually a Yiddish word. The Yiddish word for gossip is something different. It's actually like a name, like yenta is a name in Yiddish and has been co-opted to mean gossip or busybody because of Yiddish theater and actors who portrayed characters who were Jewish gossip, and then that's when they started using the word yenta to mean gossip. It also comes up in Jewish comics, for example, ones in The Forward, which is still a Jewish publication, and yenta in the comics was like a, they say quote unquote, hen-pecking wife, which is a stereotype that we're going to talk about next week. And that's basically how it came about. It doesn't actually mean gossip. It doesn't actually mean busybody, but it's used pretty colloquially in Jewish circles, at least Ashkenazi Jewish circles, to mean a gossip. It is not, in fact, the word for matchmaker, though. A lot of people have that confused because of Fiddler on the Roof, which actually has a character named Yenta, which is the matchmaker, and that is basically like a mistake that was made because there's no correlation between the two.
I didn't know that.
Am I missing anything?
All, actually.
I know. I was like, oh, geez,
It's confusing. I like knew some of
Abby,
it, but I didn't realize that it was such a new term. I thought it was like really old, and especially because I feel like I get called a yenta all the time. That I like thought it was like deep in Polish or like Eastern European Jewish colloquial stuff, but it's really not. It's very American Jewish. Which I don't know what that says about anything, but it's a interesting thing that I think is not how we think of yenta as a idea.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's because of how it was used in Jewish American culture, in theater and art, that made people be like, oh, this must come from across the ocean and ancestral, but yeah, very much American Jewish, which is super interesting. What is gossip? How can we define gossip? I have the definition of gossip, but I think we're going to try to expand it this episode. The official definition of gossip, as per the Oxford English Dictionary, is casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. Which, sure, I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, it's making me think of a podcast that Abby introduced me to called Normal Gossip, which is fantastic for people who are interested in gossip. And they talk about all the things that would also fall in this category, and Abby could probably summarize it better. But it was just making me think of normal gossip, which I love.
I also think it makes me think of a messy gossip, like the idea of a messy gossip. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think gossip can be also things that are true and a powerful tool and like a subversive tool. And I don't know, that definition just like sounds messy. And I'm not against messy gossip, but I feel like that is maybe something that is like a very social media thing.
Absolutely. And I wrote this down when I was brainstorming for our episode. I feel like when we think about gossip, like the way that gossip is portrayed, it's always portrayed as a really negative or messy thing in pop culture and media. And I think that's where we get this really negative association with gossip. And as you were talking, yeah, and what if sometimes it is messy? Like, support evil women, like, support women being messy. Who cares if gossip is sometimes messy? I say women because of something that I'm going to mention about gossip being a cultural tool. Not to say that everyone doesn't gossip, because everyone gossips.
I just want to throw in too, because there's also things like reports about other people typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. In normal gossip, one of the episodes, they point out that's investigative journalism. Like, until stories develop, it's like somebody saw something somewhere and we're worried about it. It's like all the headlines. So to say that gossip is conversation, unconstrained, like, it makes it just sound like this thing that flows out of us and we're like, should be ashamed of it, but actually it's the basis of a lot of other things that then become legitimized through institutions.
That is a great point. Gossip is just like uncredited journalism, so jot that down. I'm rewatching Gossip Girl right now, and it feels just like perfect timing for this episode. And I feel like there's so much in that. Gossip is negative technically in the realm of that show, but also it functions to bring all of those characters together in very specific ways and bring to light truths that in the end strengthen relationships and build community. So I think there's an academic article to be written on Gossip Girl and how it frames gossip. But speaking of, let's talk about how gossip is subversive, because Abby, I heard you use that word as well. And one of the articles that I read in preparation for today that I loved talks about the subversive power of gossip. I'll give like a brief overview of that article, and then I would love to hear your thoughts, Abby and Jessie. That article is by Maria Tatter, TBD and pronunciation of Maria's last name. And it's really great. It'll be linked in our resources. Super recommend that you read it. It basically talks about how all of the reasons that we consider gossip bad are because of the ways that culture and society have related gossip to women. And so when we think about gossip, like I did it subconsciously earlier, we're thinking about women or femme people like talking amongst themselves basically and like sharing information. And so people might be scared of gossip because of the fact that it knits women together, as Maria says in this article, and basically creates these social networks that exist outside of the typical patriarchal control and oversight that generally dictates our social networks. And also is a lot of storytelling, which is a very community-based way of sharing information and carrying on stories and traditions. And the author of this article talks about how it becomes a support system and a resource for people who are confined to the domestic sphere generally. So if we're thinking about, I think that's maybe a little bit less relevant now in 2023, but definitely in the ways that it was important leading up to today. She has this one quote that I really love, which is that language has, of course, always been the one resource available to those who have been subordinated, disenfranchised, or dispossessed. And I think that is really powerful and speaks to why gossip, I think, is demonized, and of course, why it's so important. Some other things that really stuck out to me from this article are like, she mentions a few different anthropological studies. One of them talks about how groups basically view women talking and men talking, and again, this is very binary, very differently. So when men are talking together, it's viewed as good-natured and lighthearted, but when women are talking together, even if they're talking about very similar things, it's seen as like malicious or like inflammatory, basically. Also talk about the fact that there's not really evidence that supports women gossiping more than men, and how like all different forms of like language and speaking to each other, like anecdotes, proverbs, folk tales, conventional wisdom, urge to become gossip and then like become considered this quote unquote female or woman form of communication and bonding. She also talks about the idea that gossip is just adding texture to stories and turning it from something simple into something that actually has weight, and how a lot of pieces of gossip actually turn into folklore that carries ancestral forms of wisdom, which I thought was really cool. Also, just reflecting on the times that I gossip, I feel like so much of that is not built up, but actually just like truths being shared amongst each other. But yeah, curious what y'all thought of that article or those ideas.
I really like this article, and I also really want to apply these concepts about the domestic sphere and everything to power and the workplace in today, and how there are certain jobs or certain workplaces where people are expected to like remain in silence or remain compliant, and how gossip in workplaces or in like domestic spheres, but also just in childcare or just all these different areas in which it has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. Like the people doing the labor is still the same people who were doing it like 200 years ago. It's just a different title, and how that translates into our workplace culture or like working culture. Abby has a lot more to say about this because I know we've talked about it. So I'm really curious what Abby wants to share.
I think it's a like survival technique, and that we've learned to do that to survive, but also that there's so many like organizing that has been done by women, and I can only imagine that it's the gossip that's happened in the room, in different rooms, being like, oh, this is not my own experience, that has led to teachers unions and garment factory organizing. And there's one example I'm really thinking about, but it's from the 12th century, which is this like mikvah rebellion that happened in the 12th century in Egypt. And like all these women for like years in this coordinated like rebellion decided not to use the mikvah. They used a hammam instead. And I can only imagine that it was gossip as a subversive way, and what you were saying about the domestic sphere that led to like such like strong, and I think like what you were saying, Jessie, is that we continue to see that in the workplace, and that is women who are non-cis men who are able to subvert these powers.
The Mikvah Rebellion is the coolest thing I've ever heard about. It's stronger when you have a shared identity that is marginalized, also discredited by the oppressing power, because then you get away with talking in a way that people aren't really paying attention to, which is also a trend throughout Jewish history. And so Jewish women's organizing throughout the ages. I feel like there's a lot of Jewish women control the household, or they like convince everyone to do it, whatever they want, as like a joke, but as a survival mechanism, that like you don't have power over your home, or you don't have power over the economics of the family, but like you can sway entire societies by this network that you've created of basically old school organizing. So I think gossip is absolutely key to that.
I'm wondering if that's like always been a thing about Jewish women and the writing of the Torah, with the story of Miriam. Miriam was like doing like bad, messy gossip. I'm like not going to stand by her, but she like gossiped about Moses's wife and with Aaron, and Miriam got punished with leprosy. And it feels like a very ancient example of punishing messy gossips. And I don't know what the writers of the Torah were trying to do with that one, but like I can only imagine it is to make sure women know that when they do that, they will have scaly skin.
Yeah, I always think about that part too. Is a fantastic example of like how Aaron doesn't have to deal with responsibility ever in Torah, and also that perfect example of Miriam being the backbone of the entire Moses story from the beginning through finding water in the desert and still getting the most in trouble. It's like a perfect example of how women are both expected to do all the labor and then penalized the most when something goes wrong. And I think that's a really interesting part of the gossip story as well.
But I was also thinking, when y'all were talking about the workplace and how gossip like brings about change and like unionizes people, I'm thinking even just about the simple conversations around like salary disclosure and like talking to each other about like how much everyone makes, and that feels like small and I think is viewed as gossipy, but then can make these like really big changes about pay, just pay changes and making sure everyone is being paid fairly and understanding and like bringing to light pay disparity in the workplace. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about it from that lens before.
What a good way to discredit people, right? Is what is organizing to the workers is gossip to the people in power. Like, what a good way to make workers want to aspire to be more like the people in power by being like, oh, that's messy. Don't talk to people about that because you want to be more like me. You don't want to be like those lowly people talking about each other. It's so effective. It works. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, people in power love to say that anything that's going to take power away from them is bad. Yeah. Hence, gossip being bad. I wanted to move into, if we're ready for that, like a social worky psych lens on gossip that I just thought was really interesting and furthers the point that gossip is actually really positive and beneficial. One of our other resources is this really cool study done by, let me get their names so I'm crediting them correctly, but it's done by two people, Ishan Jolly and Luke Chen. I think it is done at Dartmouth, maybe. It's like a neuroscience study, and I was like, whoa, this is very sciencey. But it talks about how gossip drives vicarious learning and facilitates social connection, and they actually conduct studies to demonstrate how that happens. Basically, I won't repeat the study because it's a pretty long article, but they provide evidence that gossip is actually really rich and multifaceted and plays a really critical role in social bonding and vicarious learning. For people who don't know what vicarious learning is basically like when people gain certain understandings about their world and adjust their behavior without actually having to experience something. So learning something through hearing about it instead of actually experiencing it. And so they basically talk about how like the social information that people acquire through gossip helps people learn things without experiencing them, and then this in turn directly influences future behavior. And in this way, like the people that we talk to really influence each other, and in that way we also build these really strong social bonds. They talk about this one study that was done on gossip where 14% of the conversations that we have daily are comprised of gossip, and that gossip is primarily neutral rather than like positive or negative at all. And so they basically make the statement that it suggests that a lot of these like societal implications about gossip being negative don't actually reflect the majority of real world conversational behavior. I also talk about how gossip is proposed to be like a very human form of what they call social grooming, which is analogous to physical grooming by other primates, which is a way to build trust and these strong social bonds. So I thought that was really interesting. You know how we see those videos of the gorillas like grooming each other, and that is how they build bonds. Like us gossiping is like doing the same thing. And I thought that was really sweet.
Also, gossip as like protection and survival, especially in the workplace, as we're talking about. They reference in this article the Me Too movement beginning as like a whisper network of, hey, did this happen to you because this happened to me? And that being the start of bringing down these really terrible, terrifying men and companies. And I think that is one of the most powerful and only times that gossip is considered socially acceptable is when you have to tell someone, like, what do you mean you didn't report it? Because then it's like you're shamed for not saying more about your experience, but that this is how people get through abusive, oppressive, violent workplaces is by telling each other what's happening and who to avoid and who to go to and who not to go to. Just thought that was a really interesting part.
Yeah, 100%. I'm thinking about like predating the Me Too movement or even like our present day, where I think it is a bit more normalized to be upfront about like shitty things happening in the workplace and abuse happening in the workplace. Like gossip is absolutely how people have protected themselves and survived for generations just by sharing that information amongst themselves, even before it was normal to then report that or go to HR with that information, or before it was safe to report or go to whatever mechanism the company has to maybe protect its employees.
I also, and I want to hear from Abby because I'm talking a lot, thinking about pretty much like non-men's health issues as well. Talking to a lot of men who like never knew that somebody close to them had an abortion, or never knew that somebody close to them went through cancer treatments or went through STI crisis or any of these things. And they're like, how do you know that? And it's like, because we talk about these things, but that can sometimes be considered gossip as well, because it didn't exactly happen to me, but I care about this person and I want them to know, like all of these things. And just like sometimes men aren't really included in those because it's considered TMI or gross, or I don't know, there's all these different things that then men like don't understand the human experience in the same way because they don't get included in those gossip conversations. So I find that interesting as well. But Abby, what are your thoughts?
No, I think that's a really good point. I think that's true. And it's also interesting, like, I don't know, like when you hear it, I've been thinking about one of that information, but from someone else, about someone else, and where that like line is. I'm thinking more in the terms of workplace, anything. But when someone has something bad happen, and like I hear about it, and I hear about it happening to someone else, and often I talk about it, I'm like, oh, this person had the same experience, and that can be like two things. It can be this thing that's you can't do that, and that's gossip, and that's really people's information. It's the same thing for like health issues, I think, which there's even more of a line there. All of these things to happen, like the Me Too movement, but also like any organizing or even any solidarity to happen. Like when there's, I don't know, a yenta who is maybe spreading other people's business a little bit, but in a powerful way. So I don't know, but it also makes me think about who you can trust and gossip around who you can trust in a workplace. And I know, to me, people who have started a new job have come up and really been like, can I trust you? Who can I trust? And I think that is a really important piece of all of that, which has been mentioned, but I just emphasize that gossip does allow you to know that. And often for men, they don't know any of the information because they can't be trusted. Not all men.
Not all men. Love it. But that just made me think of, Abby, though, gossip is an investment in another person. Like, it's, I trust you with this information, and I trust that even if we're gossiping about it, you're not going to go spread it around. Let me just tell you what I just heard from this person, because it's like a lot of you're saying from that article, like it's a social bond. I'm depositing something in this relationship that we share now and will hold us together. And it is a mutual experience in a way, because now you're bound by this information in a way, and also like a shared analysis, because that is the worst feeling in the world when you go to someone with a piece of gossip that you think is going to be interpreted a certain way, and they're like, oh, that's fine. And you're like, and you lose that social experience. Like, you're waiting for the other person's response in a way that makes it more meaningful than just like, the joy isn't always in telling the person the piece of information. It's like seeing their reaction and hearing their thoughts, and it's like a really deep form of dialogue, I think.
Yeah, it's like a shared experience. I feel like so many friendships are built out of that like initial coming together, and that's real. Okay, so more gossip 2023. Gossip is in 2023. We are gossiping.
Yeah, and not feeling shame for it, which we didn't talk a lot about shame, but don't let people shame you for gossiping. It's what I want people to walk away with.
First of all, everyone's gossiping.
Yeah. And I think more workplace gossip, I'm just going to say, sometimes they try to shut it down, but if you want, everyone should be doing some workplace gossip, because it is actually a power tool. So you're doing something important if you're gossiping in the workplace.
You heard it here first, folks. Gossip in the workplace.
And owning gossip about yourself, I feel, is great as well. Because if you're in control of what you know everyone's going to talk about, I just feel like it's so empowering in a way, rather than being like, I wonder what people are going to say. I'm going to start the first rumor, and it's going to sound like this. I don't know, a lot like reclaiming your power in a way than worrying about what other people think of you. So gossip about yourself more, too.
I love it. Okay, do we have Any other gossip tidbits to add before we close our first session out? Okay, our next session is on February 22nd, and that's going to be a little bit more Jewish focused now that we've like overarchingly talked about gossip and how it's the best thing ever. Abby, I hope that you'll join us for that session too. I love having a resident gossip Jewish expert for these sessions. So hopefully Abby will be with us for that session. So join us while we're all being yentas in 2 weeks. Apologies for any sound issues based on some of the tech difficulties we had. It happens. And shout out to Nate for our podcast music. Also, sign up for our newsletter in order to get all of the juicy resources that we mentioned in this episode. Am I missing anything?
No, that was perfect.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Abby, for
fun.
joining us.
Yeah.
This was so great.
I had a blast.
Yay!
Yes.